Let's see how this works. Got the name of the game. Sifu. People be crazy. All right, we're gonna do some research. I'm gonna check out 2 games that are on sale. Actually, how many games? 2 games. All right, I got the few games set up. Wood Tames 2 came out. They love showing me Napoleon movies, let me tell you. YouTube thinks I'm Napoleon 2.0 right now. I need to know every single stat on his life. All right, let's get into it. I'm gonna eat, so we're just gonna watch some random videos. Maybe seafood, maybe Card Simulator might be a better one. Maybe Card Simulator might be a smarter idea here.
Jaden Ivey had to be stretchered off the court earlier tonight after suffering what appeared to be a pretty significant injury to his left ankle / lower leg. And
That's his knee. That's not his ankle, homie.
Talk about what exactly could have happened here and the ultimate severity. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Suter, and the goal in this channel is to teach you more about the medical side of the sports world. So we're going to be taking a look here tonight at what happened with Jaden Ivey. Now, of course, we saw all the way at the end of this sequence, of course, Ivey's got his left lower leg probably in some sort of a vacuum splint or an immobilization device, which hints at the ultimate severity. Whenever you see somebody with their joint being immobilized to this degree, taken off on a stretcher, that implies there's probably some type of fracture and or joint dislocation. And this degree of immobilization is being done because you need to protect, you need to stabilize that joint while you get somebody off to the hospital. Looking at this play for Ivey, I would think of this as the injury mechanism that causes a high ankle sprain. This is just the extreme version of what can happen when it's more severe. So here, as Ivey is trying to get the ball here, we see the Orlando defender dive in. I'm not going to get into whether or not this was like a rough play or not. You know, guy's just trying to make a play, but certainly Anthony diving into his leg is what causes this injury to occur. The foot in this position of Ivey, you can see how it's pointed forward and planted onto the ground. So then as the Magic player comes and dives in here, you're going to cause this valgus force to be loaded into that leg, but his foot and ankle get essentially stuck on the ground. So in this position, that foot is now externally rotated, pointed out to the side, while that load is coming in on that leg. And what that's going to do is it's going to put this torsional, this rotational stress through the ankle joint, and I suspect ultimately cause a fracture of potentially the inner part of his ankle, also potentially leading to an ankle dislocation or at least an unstable ankle joint. When we see this happen, what can typically occur on the more minor side is you can get either a sprain of the deltoid ligament complex that sits on the inside part of the ankle with an eversion mechanism. More commonly, you get tearing of that high ankle sprain ligament, that syndesmosis that connects that lower portion of the fibula to the tibia and results in a high ankle sprain. But if the energy is high enough, the force gets transmitted in just the right way, you can ultimately extend that trauma to the ankle enough that you cause a fracture plus or minus a dislocation. Looking at our biodigital anatomy tool here, straight on, this is going to be the tibiotalar, the ankle joint. Here's our tibia, the shin bone. This is going to be the fibula. And so this is going to be the outer portion of the ankle. If we rotate this around and look at the back, of course, that load from the Magic player is coming in this direction while the foot is pointed outward. So what that's going to do at a minimum is it's going to cause this talus within the ankle joint to rotate externally, which puts tension on this AITFL ligament, causing it to want to pull, leading to typically the high ankle sprain type of injury pattern. However, if the force is transmitted high enough and in the right way, ultimately that ligament can fail. The next stabilizing structures are going to be the bone, specifically the medial malleolus, the lateral malleolus. And so you can get a fracture of this medial or lateral malleolus, the distal part of the fibula. And depending on which of the ligaments, the extent of the break, sometimes an ankle dislocation. Now, I suspect because we saw them put on this vacuum splint, there was enough gross instability in the ankle that they were worried about an unstable joint. And that spectrum between the joint being completely dislocated versus just an unstable joint with a fracture is a little bit of just kind of splitting hairs for the sake of this discussion. But whenever you get enough of the break in the bony stabilizers and the ligament stabilizers, this joint is unstable, and so another bit of excessive force or something like that can cause it to completely dislocate. We couldn't really tell exactly with Ivey if it truly dislocated like a Gordon Hayward type of situation, or if it was just potentially what we call a bi or a trimalleolar fracture, which still is treated like an unstable ankle in terms of what all has to get put back together and ultimately constructed. I don't think this was a fracture of like higher up in the tibia or higher up in the fibula like we saw with, for example, Aiden Hutchinson in the NFL. I suspect what we're dealing with here is an ankle fracture plus or minus dislocation. If that's the case, probably would expect that he's going to be done for the year if it is an unstable joint with multiple parts of the bone fractured. If all that happened was just one of these two parts of the malleoli being broke, potentially a return later this season. But typically when we see this degree of trauma, immobilization with that vacuum splint, concern for multiple fractures through the ankle with possible dislocation, typically that's going to be a season-ending type of injury. Now there's a lot of time left in the NBA season, depending on where the Pistons go and what they want to do with his recovery, but I would ultimately be prepared for this to be a season-ending injury, unfortunately, for Ivy. So that's it for the video, everybody. Thank you again for watching. Let me know any questions or comments down below. And until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.
On December 29th at 9 a.m.
I'm too time in this.
in South Korea, disaster struck when Jeju Air Flight 2216 crashed at Muan International Airport. This was a really tragic event because of the 181 passengers on board, 179 passed away. That includes 6 crew members, and the only survivors were the 2 members in the back of the plane. Being an aerospace engineer, this one's really hard for me. These tragedies are always tough to look at. But as engineers, we often learn from tragedies like this. Most of our aviation regulations have come from previous mishaps. So let's see if we can't look at what happened between the airport, the plane, the operations, what we know so far before the actual reports come out, and see if we can't make sense of it. I'm Ricky, and this is Stupid Da Vinci. So this is Jeju Air Flight 2216 flying from Bangkok to Muan. This is a red-eye flight leaving around 2 a.m. local time and 4.5 hours of total flight time. Everything was normal until about here. So at 450 feet, 138 knots, everything was pretty normal. So you can see the speed picks up and altitude picks up, and that's the last data that we have. So at 8:57, the air traffic control issued a warning of birds in the vicinity, and then there's a slight veer off course based on the flight data that we had. That was the path that I should have taken, and there's a slight deviation, and then finally data stops transmitting right about here. Now what's interesting is that this airport has a lot of bird activity. These are known feeding and roosting areas for migratory birds. As you can see, there's a large swath of these areas across the airport. Now, Muan Airport was a largely domestic airport until recently, and now it's an international airport. Also, the aircraft in question, tail number Hotel Lima 8088, was also involved in this weird emergency landing situation for a flight going from South Korea to China that diverted and landed at Incheon safely. But something happened there as well. That we'll have to figure out exactly if that played a role in this. But this was tragic because there was a bird strike. According to the pilot communications, we'll know 100% certainty soon. There was a bird strike, probably a flame out, and that's where you've probably seen this video already. You can see that what looks kind of like a backfire there on the right engine. Now that is from a compressor stall. That means that there was some sort of a change in the airflow feeding the compressor inlet, and that's what that is right there. Now, we don't actually know for sure if it was a bird strike. That stuff will come out in time, but clearly something happened, and the pilots took evasive action. They aborted their takeoff and came back around. You can see here they were supposed to come and land on runway 01, but they aborted that to come around. And on this reapproach, they got clearance to land on runway 19. It's the same runway, 2 different orientations. All runways have basically 2 orientations you can land in, and they landed on runway 19 in the other direction. Now, what's really interesting about this is how quickly all this happened. Typically, when you have some sort of event, you need time to go through a checklist of evasive or emergency procedures that are spelled out for each aircraft, and go through the checklist to make sure you've done everything. For example, if an engine flames out, there are engine reignition procedures, and you need time to do that. But because between the aborted landing and then finally touching down, it was only about 3 or 4 minutes, so there was not enough time for any of that. And we'll get back to the aircraft considerations here in a minute. But one of the things that happened is on this runway, typically, you want to land clear of the threshold and probably somewhere around here. But what actually ended up happening is if the runway measurement starts around here, it didn't touch down until about 1,200 meters, so probably around here, unfortunately. And so that means almost a third of the runway was already used up before they actually touched down. Now, this happens because of a phenomenon called ground effect. Ground effect is when an aircraft is flying close to the ground, the vortices coming off the wings are actually hitting the ground and lifting the plane back up. You probably all felt this before when you're coming in for landing. It feels like you should be touching down any second, and there's a few more seconds while you're riding on a cushion of air, plus the pilot is flaring the wheels to make sure there's a nice smooth landing on the main landing gear to minimize damage and to have a nice soft landing. But here, that ground effect kept the plane from touching down sooner. So by the time it touched down, over 1,000 meters of the runway was already consumed, leaving not much left for actually coming to a stop. Now, the landing gear was not extended, which is something that we'll get back to here in a second. But as you can see here at this airport, once you've cleared the threshold, you have about 250 meters from the end of the runway here to this embankment. And that is a requirement, and that was met. But this embankment is a big part of the question right now, because if you look here, this is where the instrument landing system localizer is located. Now, this is hardware that communicates the position of the aircraft to give a nice, clear approach. Now, this is a better visual because this shows you how you lift it up. Typically, the mount is always flush with ground level, and you have elevated platform upon which you can seat it. That's not what happened here. That is a 4-meter tall embankment, and it's actually concrete reinforced to lift it up. And the localizers were actually on pretty small metal platforms, but this here is a huge reason why the plane crashed the way it did. An aircraft coming in at 250 knots that weighs 65,000 kilograms has a lot of energy, and the name of the game when it comes to remediating a crash is to absorb the energy as safely and over a long period of time as possible. But here, that embankment would have just been an unmovable force. Interestingly, people have brought up the fact that past it is a cinder block wall, which is also pretty unusual. Normally, airports have very thin metal for this reason, to minimize any potential impact with aircraft. But if you do this thought experiment, that cinder block wall wouldn't have been too big of a deal. If you take a sledgehammer to a cinder block wall, you can destroy it pretty quickly. But take a sledgehammer to the side of a mountain or like a big pile of dirt, and you're not going to move it. You're not going to even put a dent in it. There's so much land mass, there's so much mass that you're not going to be able to compete with that. And aircraft aren't made to deal with collisions, right? They're made to be ultra light to be able to fly. So that is a huge concern here at this airport. Now, part of the story that I think hasn't really been told is that Muan International Airport is undergoing construction. You can kind of see it here in this overhead satellite view. But I think they're extending the runway. And this probably led a role in a couple of things. For one, all airports have bird mitigation technology, either large sounds, lasers, and worst case scenario, you have people who can actually shoot munitions to kill birds to prevent ingestion into engines because birds and planes don't mix, and this has been a problem since the beginning of aviation. Now, most airports have a lot of mitigation that goes for miles around to keep air and bird collisions to a minimum. But I think what happened was that some of those mitigation techniques and technologies weren't fully employed and implemented because of all the construction going on. So ultimately, you want a longer airport, you want to be able to have a longer runway. They might have been working on that, and there might have been potential fixes to handle the bird problems better. But that wasn't fully intact. We'll know more, obviously. But let's compare this airport to my airport, which is San Diego International. And I want to show you something that I know for a fact is going to change. This is our home airport here in San Diego. Now, interestingly, it has a similar runway length, around 2,800 meters. And airplanes land typically in this orientation and come to a stop up here.
Oopsie.
Now, you'll notice that there's a parking lot up here, but this is just a chain link fence. So if you went all the way past all of this, you would still potentially have some room, and then you'd have, a bay to contend with. But there's no hard barriers of any kind. Plus, there's some interesting other technologies at play. If you notice after this runway, you notice this part right here, this kind of grid pattern, that's called an EMAS system, or an engineered materials arrestor system. This is built beyond the threshold of runways to be able to help bring aircraft to a stop. It's built basically with large tiles that you break and collapse as you come across it with your landing gear, which we'll get back to. And the goal is to increase the friction and to bring the aircraft to a stop, or to bleed off that energy and speed more quickly. Let's see if I have a video of this system at play. That's what it looks like right there. So it's a big, large set of tiles that an aircraft will collide with. You can see it right there, and eat into and come to a stop. Now, this could potentially damage aircraft. As you can see here, if you don't bleed off that energy and aircraft is able to go careening into something, it can be much worse. This system is a lot like on a freeway with cars. If you ever see those barrels of water or other barriers, the goal is to absorb energy. If you go careening into a barrel of water, you send that water flying up into the sky, well, that takes energy. That energy comes from the kinetic energy you used to have in your car. And that's what you want to do. You want to convert that energy into other forms and to help bleed off your energy to come to a stop. This system was not implemented at Milan International Airport. This is not particularly common. It's not everywhere, but this is being rolled out, especially in airports that have smaller thresholds, smaller safe zones beyond the runway. And this is something that they will definitely implement. I think there's going to be a major case for why you can't have any hard obstacle, especially an embankment, concrete encased embankment for anything, even if it is landing equipment for the aircraft, which has to be in the center line of the runway. There has to be a way to build it with steel poles and aircraft can kind of glide and go through without breaking up and just going into a ball of fire. So from the airport side of things, bird mitigation is a huge concern. It has been around the world since the dawn of aviation, and that's something that has to be addressed. Two, we have to make sure that there are no hard embankments on any of the overshoot sections of runways to be able to keep that to a minimum. And finally, the EMAS system, something that can actually crumble or help bring the aircraft to a stop. But in all the videos that I showed of the EMAS system, you notice that the landing gear was down. The landing gear is a point of focus of force, high pressure, breaks into the tiles and comes to a stop. In this flight, the landing gear was not extended. This is the underside of a 737 to the main landing gear here. The nose landing gear is behind a door up there. Now, in the videos that we've seen, there's no evidence of any shirt off doors or anything, so it appears the gear was never extended. And here are your engines. This is from the bottom, but this would be the left engine over here. Look at it from the top, and the right engine. I bring this up because if you want to understand how the hydraulics of an aircraft work, the engines provide the hydraulic pressure via pumps, and the hydraulic systems are isolated. Here's a quick look at what you would see in the cabin. If you notice here for hydraulic system A, you have engine 1 and electric 2, right? And then for hydraulic system B, you have electric 1 and engine 2. What that means is that the hydraulic system is highly redundant. Here is in blue is system A, and in green is system B. And there's actually a third system, a standby system and reservoir that can also power some of these various systems. So the way this works is that there's an engine-driven pump for system A from engine number 1, which would be the left engine, and electric motor-driven pump from engine 2. And then for system B, you have the opposite. You have the actual physical pumping driven by the engine from number 2, the right engine, and the electric pump from the left engine. This redundancy allows you to be able to lose one engine and not lose any system. Because remember, the engines don't just provide thrust, they also power hydraulics, and they also provide electricity to the cabin for your in-flight entertainment, for radar, for all electronic systems of an airplane. So the electric pumps can also provide power. So in this situation, if we had a bird strike in one of the engines, and in the videos it looks like it was the right engine that took the bird strike, but we don't fully know. The picture could have been mirrored, right? Sometimes in vertical videos and TikTok and Instagram, I've seen people flip the videos left to right with the mirror. So we don't really know for sure. But if the right engine were to take a strike, the system should have been fine because it is driven by the engine on the left. But in the landing videos we've seen so far, you'll notice something here. If you look, it's kind of hard to tell, but you see that plume around this engine? This is the right engine. That is that high pressure, high heat plume of exhaust that kind of provides a little bit of a haze. You can kind of see that right here. Whereas this engine appears to be off, and that would be the left engine. So if the left engine were to have a flame out and not be running, then it wouldn't drive the hydraulic pumps directly, but it would be powered by the electric motor driven pump from engine 2, which is the right engine. So even if one of the engines were to go out, you should still have hydraulic system pressure. Now, with hydraulics, there's two things to keep in mind. One is the fluid itself. If you were to shear one of the hydraulic lines and lose hydraulic fluid, then a pump wouldn't help you because you would lose hydraulic fluid, right? But that's why most modern aircraft have what's called hydraulic fuses, kind of like a fuse in an electric system. If it detects a really high level of flow, it'll shut off and restrict to minimize how much of the hydraulic fluid is lost. So two independent systems, system A and system B, and they both kind of operate some things together. As we mentioned, you can see that in green, all the elevators, ailerons, brakes, all the systems, the rudders can be powered by either one. And the main landing gear and nose landing gear extension is only powered by system A. But even then, you can kind of see here that for retraction, system B can actually retract the gear thanks to a power transfer unit, which can then power the gear retraction. For the landing gear, it takes a lot more power to retract it, right? Because you're fighting against gravity to put the wheels up. To extend it, it could potentially just be gravity fed. Now, there's more complications than that because the landing gear has to also lock. And you'll get a tone in the cabin if the gear is down but not locked. If it's not locked, it'll just collapse when you land. And a lot of different systems depend upon that weight on wheel sensor. When you have the weight on the wheels, that's when your nose wheel steering, for example, is enabled. And a lot of other systems are enabled. Those are shut off and not allowed to be used when the weight on wheel sensor is not on. So first you have to preserve the hydraulic fluid, make sure that you don't bleed that out. I've seen that happen before in aircraft. I remember on the F-18 program, we had a brake issue where QA would slide out, snap a hydraulic line, and you would just leak out hydraulic fluid on the flight deck. It's a huge problem. Second, you have to maintain the pressure in the hydraulic system with these pumps. And in the case of these different reservoir systems, you have direct feed pumps that are powered by the engines. And then you also have electronic pumps that are powered by the engine's generator output as well. And so there should be great redundancy. So if you look at this landing, there's a couple of other oddities. For example, the thrust reverser right here is open. That little gap is what's called a thrust reverser. And if we look, people have said that it doesn't appear to be open on the left side, which doesn't appear to be. So that would be a asymmetric thrust reverser situation. It's pretty uncommon. Normally you have those activate together. So that leads to potentials for, yeah, there might have been a hydraulic system issue. But that still doesn't explain why the landing gear is not down. Because like I mentioned, the landing gear is really just potentially gravity fed. There's a way to be able to actuate it even without the systems. There's a little manual door release here behind the pilots that you can pull. And these are cable driven, and you can actually extend the nose landing gear and the left and right sides of the main landing gear, all without hydraulic pressure. That's again because it's gravity fed, and all you have to do is release it and let gravity do the rest. There's more complications than that because again, you need that lock, and if you don't have the lock, then the gear will just collapse when you touch down. There's like an over center mechanism that needs to be triggered to keep the gear down and locked. But the asymmetric thrust reversers are kind of a question mark that are hard to explain. Now, when it comes to slowing down an aircraft, there's a couple of things that we can do. The first are flaps. So these are the trailing edge flaps at the tail end of the wing. There's also leading edge flaps, and the way that they work are they change the geometry of the wing during takeoff and landing. They give you more lift. So the leading edge flap extends downward, and the way that they're measured is from this chord line. So if you look at the wing, that's the chord line. The leading edge flaps will extend outward this way, and the trailing edge flaps extend out this way. And in essence, then you've got yourself a bigger wing for better lift. Now this is great during takeoff and landing because now you can have higher lift at lower airspeed. That's the name of the game. And then when you're at full cruising altitude, you fold everything back in and have a nice clean configuration. This flight, Jeju Air 2216, came in clean, meaning there were no flaps deployed either. Again, that could be a telltale sign of hydraulic issues. Or just flaps not being deployed. So normally when you land, you want to have the flaps down to 30 or 40 degrees.
Plane was
to
fucked
minimize
up.
the needed airspeed coming in. If you do that, you might be flying at 120 to 150 knots when you touch down compared to 250 knots, which is likely what happened with this flight. That's that much more energy. Remember, the kinetic energy is 1/2 mv squared. So if you increase the speed, it's the factor of the square of that speed. That's a lot of energy at play, and it all went careening into that embankment. So if we had the flaps deployed, that would have helped. The second thing are the spoilers or the air brake. All right, so here we see the flaps, and these are the air brakes or the spoilers, and those deploy on touchdown. Once you make contact with the ground, those spoilers deploy to, again, further increase the drag and to slow down the aircraft. Those also were not deployed. Now, normally, you don't want to deploy these means of slowing down until you have a controlled landing, because you lose authority, right? If those air brakes deploy at different speeds, you could potentially lose where you are on the runway, and we've mentioned, if you don't keep that straight heading and you go off to the side, then you would miss any safety measures anyway. Thrust reversers are the next one. Again, you want to deploy thrust reversers after you touch down, and the thrust reverser is an ingenious way of taking the engine's output, and instead of having to shoot right out the back, right, you take the inlet, goes to the compressor, and then it gets shot out the back. Instead, you have a door that opens, and instead of the air going right through, the air hits this ram and shoots back in the same direction, slowing you down. Now, in this situation, it looked like one thrust reverser was open, but not both, but that is another weird situation that's hard to explain. But those are the means that you have to slow down, and a lot of that wasn't fully handled. For me personally, as far as the aircraft itself, it comes down to not having very much time. From the time they abandoned their landing to then coming back around and landing again, it was only a couple of minutes, and there's nowhere near enough time to go through the entire operation of what you should do. Normally what happens is, one option is just to continue with the landing. If you get a bird strike and you lost one engine, you still have the other engine, system should be good, and you've already done all the hard work of lining up and being on glide slope and coming in. You could just resume the landing and then touch down unless something were to happen. Now, they clearly had enough aircraft authority to be able to maneuver, come back around, and land dead center in the center lane of the runway. So they probably had control of the aircraft. The next thing is you can go into a holding pattern and then try to go through your reset procedures, maybe try to